I don't typically repeat a sermon unless I'm on a lecture tour, but I'm going to share some thoughts with you today that I prepared for the Anderson Progressive Theology Conference earlier this year, which they failed to record well, so I tried it again in Exeter, England, the first week of June, and their recording equipment broke down just as we were starting the conference. But you all haven't heard it except for my good friend Paul Tomlinson, who traveled with me on my lecture tour in South Carolina, so this will be your third or fourth time to hear it. And I just feel like you deserve this somehow. I don't know what sin this is making up for, but it's you and me, brother. But what I will promise our internet audience and all of you here today, that what you're going to hear from me today will not vary from what you would hear if you were in a classroom at Harvard or Vanderbilt or Yale or Princeton. The one thing we really try to do in this church is to try to make current academic thought seem to be persuasive and to encourage churches to embrace it. But we're all still trying to figure out what it means to be a progressive person of faith, and it is a moving target. It's always moving. Please allow me to engage you in a little memory experiment. Some of you will remember this one, but I'm going to quote a very familiar passage from the Bible, and I would like for you to repeat it back to me. Ich bin gekommen, auf das ihr Leben und Walle genug habet sollen. Now, if you speak German with a distinct Kentucky accent, you might have been able to do that, but otherwise, it's nearly impossible. We'll just try the same passage. It's John 10:10 in English, and repeat it after me. I have come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. See, even if you've never heard the passage before, it's probably not that difficult for you to repeat. As English speakers, we have places in our brains for English words, places created through repetition. My 30-year-old daughter has the same cell phone number that she has had for 15 years, and I cannot tell you what it is. From the beginning, it has been programmed into my phone, so I never have to dial it. I just tell my phone to call Valerie, and it calls. However, I can tell you the phone number from my parents' home in Glasgow, Kentucky, that has not been active for over 50 years. That number, through repetition, cut a groove in my brain, and it is likely to be one of the last things I will forget while lying on life support in whatever nursing home that Valerie puts me in soon. Most of us have lost loved ones who have sunk into the fog of dementia or Alzheimer's, and sometimes even when they don't know our names, they can't recognize their own children. If you begin to sing a familiar Christmas carol, as bad as they all are, oftentimes those people will brighten up and begin to sing along with you. The challenge then for progressive theology is that new information is always having to go up against the tradition and virtual muscle memory of our childhood religious experiences. For 100 years, we've been sending young seminary students to graduate school, and at least in the better schools, they've been introduced to biblical critical studies. We help them to let go of the kind of magic and superstitious thinking of the pre-modern era that brought them to seminary. We teach them to see Scripture and theology from a rational and historical perspective. In grad school, generations of students have learned that God did not write the Bible. They learned that Scripture is not either history or science, but rather it is the product of ancient cultures attempting to articulate their understanding of the world as best they could. They provide us then through Scriptures with philosophical insights, inspiration, devotional thoughts, but those things are expressed poetically, in metaphors, in stories, but not facts. No facts. But these young men and women graduate, they're ordained, they look for jobs in churches through appointments or calls, and what they face are churches that have had very little of their training, and they inherit a congregation that expects them to parrot traditional religious teachings. Ministers then try to straddle the fence. I remember the minister that I grew up under quoting Käsemann, Kant, Bultmann, Kierkegaard, while trying to speak a secret language that the congregation wouldn't understand because they hadn't read those guys, and still trying to parrot traditional religious beliefs. They are saying the words of the language of the church, and inside their own heads, it means something different to them, but in the pews, it still meant stuff straight out of the 4th century. Now, I'm not going to make this talk too tedious by cataloging major scholars and seminal books, but I do need to mention this one guy. In the 1940s, the German biblical scholar Rudolf Bultmann began publishing a series of books that were used in graduate schools for more than half a century. Many of us who went to seminary in those years cut our teeth on understanding the historical Jesus and the literary nature of Scripture by reading Bultmann. He was a true genius, and he was uniquely gifted in making material accessible to grad students. But I have one bone to pick with him, and it is this. He literally encouraged seminarians to use the language of the church, but to change the meaning of the words. They did, but who got changed in that deal? In the end, the church didn't change. The ministers changed. They kept speaking the language of the church until they literally forgot what they had learned in the classroom. Ministers either become disillusioned and dropped out of ministry, or they conformed to the expectations of the congregations. There were over 60 people in my starting class at Vanderbilt in 1980. By 1990, only a dozen of us were still in the ministry because I kept moving, and it took 20 years for a congregation to get organized enough to fire me. But I was a moving target. I was harder to hit. So this huge gulf grew between what scholars are aware of, facts, insights, an honest approach to belief in life, and then there was the church. And the two were separated by universes of knowledge. We have 100 years of scholarship bottled up in graduate schools of religion and tens of thousands of churches that have built up defenses to remain intellectually and ideologically locked into the 4th century, so that people can defend themselves by just saying, well, I'm Catholic, or I'm Lutheran, or I'm Episcopalian, or I'm Orthodox, or I'm Methodist, as if to say, I have gray hair, therefore facts have no impact on me. You think you can state a claim that I belong to a particular sect of completely confused people, and therefore I don't have to pay any attention to what is real and what is not real. In the 1980s, the former Vanderbilt professor Bob Funk called together 50 biblical scholars and 100 eager lay practitioners to start the Jesus Seminar. The stated purpose was to drill down into the historical Jesus studies and to present the best of academic conclusions to the world in a way that would finally reach into the pews of churches. Now, their methods of voting on passages of Scripture with colored beads was intended to get media attention, and it did. Not good attention, but it got attention. And by that, he hoped to provoke churches to being awakened to the academic world that they had been protected from, to increase the thinking skills, the critical thinking skills of churchgoers. Many of the scholars who have been broadly published by and are the most famous of household names among progressive churches came out of the Jesus Seminar. I suspect that you have either read or heard of my good friend John Shelby Spong, John Dominic Crossan, Karen Armstrong, and the late Marcus Board. They've sold millions of books. They have spoken at thousands of conferences. They've had specials on PBS and the BBC. They've even been interviewed on Bill Maher and on many popular talk shows on TV. But the impact of progressive thinking on the church still looks more like a scratch than a reformation. Let me give you an illustration. For several months, we had the good fortune of having one of the world's leading textual scholars, Dr. David Trobisch, stuck in Springfield dealing with family property and developing the next phase of his career. So for a couple of years, we had the good fortune of having him as our guest lecturer for us on Sunday mornings. And during that period, he was doing a series on the use of myth in narrative in Scripture. Brilliant, really helpful stuff. I mean, better than what I had heard in grad school. I really appreciated everything that David brought to us during that time. But during the Q&A one Sunday morning, a longtime member of our church, now deceased, don't try to peg it on anybody, he was a good guy. He had heard Bishop Spong at our church several times. He had listened to me for years, and he had listened to Trobisch for months. But at the end of one of Trobisch's lectures, he asked, in the Noah story, I can understand God killing all the people who were evil, but why would God kill all those animals? They weren't evil. I was simultaneously embarrassed and angry. How could you listen to all of this for years and still think that God actually flooded the earth, killing almost everybody and most of the animals? I just shouted out from the back of the room, it never happened. And David interjected without even blinking, but Roger, it happens every time the story is told. Well, that's a very nice, academic, very existential way of dealing with ancient narratives. However, it allows you to preserve the story within congregational life in a way that makes people believe it's also history. It allows people like this very nice guy to go on believing that there's an imaginary person in the clouds that can get mad enough to just kill everybody one day. And go on then to believe in angels, in heaven, and hell, and Jesus being physically resurrected, and the prospect that if you really, 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 really believe in it and repeat your prayers often enough, that the creator of the universe will intervene to help you find a good parking place during the Christmas shopping season at the Battlefield Mall. So we have this divide among progressive scholars. The last Jesus seminar meeting I attended was in the spring of 2005. Bob Funk was near death, finally succumbing to cancer. And one of the founders of the seminar was praising me to Bob Funk. And Bob Funk just got crazy mad. I'm going to blame the chemo. I don't think Bob was typically this way, but he was really angry at me for still preaching. He had totally given up on the church. He thought the church was hopeless and that I should quit wasting my life and that I should go to work in publishing or in academics where I might actually do some good. Bishop Spong, on the other hand, still goes to an Episcopal church most Sundays. He publicly recites the Apostles' Creed. He sings the old hymns that we refuse to sing, and he participates in traditional baptism and communion rituals. No one in the last generation of the church has done more than these two guys to make good scholarship available to the church. But Bob gave up on the church before he died, and John is still in the thick of it, using the same language that has lulled people to sleep for 2,000 years. I have to respectfully disagree with both of these men that I respect tremendously. I do not believe that we should give up on the church emerging from the shadows of the Council of Nicaea, but I do not agree that we should go placidly on repeating the language of traditional Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The world needs to promote progressive views of faith. We have a lot of important work to do in giving birth to a better, a more just, a more sustainable society. But I don't think we're going to get there by just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. We need a modern Reformation that dismisses magical thinking in favor of critical thinking, that lets go of superstition in favor of scientific congruity in an evidence-based faith. We need to start writing liturgy that does not undermine what we're publicly trying to say in our sermons. The liturgy, the hymns, the anthems, the prayers of our public gatherings are teaching opportunities. And if you look at most any book of worship from any denomination, what the liturgical resources teach, what's the underlying assumptions in the language in almost all of them, whether it's Presbyterian or Methodist or Episcopal or whatever, most of it sounds like it was written by someone sitting in Darwin's waiting room. And the truth of it is, the church has not always been mired in this kind of creedal biblical literalism. Karen Armstrong, exhaustively clear in her book, A Case for God, says that the history of the church has been littered with scholars, bishops, and philosophers who were not fooled by any of the literalism of traditional faith. No one had a bigger impact on scholarship prior to the modern era than Augustine of Hippo. The 4th century teacher insisted that even though the Bible clearly says that the earth is flat and covered by a solid bowl, a firmament that separates the waters above from the waters below, and angels open windows to make it rain or whatever, that to suggest that that was real would bring shame on the Christian faith, because he said in the 4th century, it is obviously not true. Now, 1,600 years ago, it was obviously not true. There are 300 churches in Springfield. How many of them do you think still think it's true that the Bible literally describes the earth this way? In the 4th century, Augustine knew that if the church continued to interpret Scripture as literally true, that it would just make us look stupid, and the whole project of the church would come to an end. In the 4th century, Augustine was saying to conservative evangelicals, come on, guys, knock it off, you're embarrassing us. In the 5th century, no one less than the prophet Muhammad said that Jesus wasn't really the incarnation of God, because that's a ridiculous idea. Nobody is an incarnation of God. Jesus was a great teacher. He was a social revolutionary, maybe a prophet. But no human is God. Think about it. It doesn't even make sense. The claim should be embarrassing on the face of it. It's poetic language, but folks, it's not good poetic language. It was a way, because Caesars were said to be a son of God, so the church said Jesus was a son of God. The coinage of the Roman Empire said that Caesar was Lord, so the church said Jesus was Lord. It's just a metaphor. Now, I'm not going to bore you with a recitation of everyone who tried to make the world wake up to the difference between literally interpreting creedal religion and the poetic metaphor of trying to express our highest ideals in the crude container of language. But over the years, you've heard me and other pastors quote major thinkers, from Voltaire to Thomas Paine to Soren Kierkegaard, Paul Tillich, the Niebuhrs. I suspect that many of us here escaped the mental prison of traditional churches by reading books by Borg, Crossan, Armstrong, and Spong, all of whom have sold millions of books over the past few decades. And yet I'm left to worry about the future of the progressive movement. Even with all of this clear, rational, scholarly information available to people who have read the books, who have heard the lectures, who have watched the videos, it seems like the evangelical world has a stranglehold on society that is so strong that people come down to this false dichotomy. Either they buy the whole thing and swallow the whole cow of believing in magic and superstition, or they become an atheist. Now, I have to ask you to forgive me for quoting Woody Allen, who is obviously a sorry excuse for a human being, but he illustrates my point so well for me that I'm going to give him just enough forgiveness to quote him in this moment. In a commencement speech he was giving a few years ago, he sardonically concluded by saying, "More than in any other time in history, we face a crossroads. One path leads to utter despair and the other to utter hopelessness. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose correctly." The choice is not between being an atheist or a traditional evangelical. Folks, we've got 500 years of great biblical theology, philosophical scholarship that represents the best and highest of human thought, and it offers to us a rational, progressive way into the future. It's not a choice between atheism or magical thinking. There is a progressive path that has dignity, that has credibility, that provides for human dignity, community, sustainability, and profound scientific and technological progress. As the great Dane once said, there are two ways in which a person can be fooled. One is to continue to believe what is clearly not true, and the other is to refuse to accept what is true. The Progressive Reformation asks the church to let go of ancient myths and creeds which clearly are not true, and to embrace the best of scholarship, which is as close to truth as humans can get. And embracing that means that we have to change how we talk. It changes how we approach Christmas. It changes how we approach Easter. It changes what hymns we sing and what readings we put in front of people. Because as Mark Twain said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you're sure of that just ain't so. Religion has made men confident to say that they were intended to rule over women. Religion has announced that homosexuality is inherently evil, or insisted that only one religion, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, is the only one that's right, which is just not true. None of that stuff is true, and all of it needs to go away. For far too long, the church has accepted that there is some mutually exclusive choice between faith or critical thinking. What I'm here saying today is that what we must do is marry our faith to our critical thinking. And I need to be allowed to rescue the word faith. We've tended to use that word to refer to things that we believe just because we believe it. We take it on faith. We claim that it is an article of belief. There is no evidence, ladies and gentlemen, for the existence of demons or of angels. There is no evidence for the existence of heaven or hell. There is no evidence that you have a soul and your dog doesn't, or the ficus tree in my living room doesn't. There is no evidence for the existence of spirits, ghosts, unicorns, leprechauns, or dragons. But history is dotted with individuals who say they've seen them. Someone who tells you they've seen a ghost has no more credibility than someone that told you they saw the Loch Ness Monster, because the only thing you can know is what can be repeated and tested. If it cannot be repeated and tested, someone may have had an experience. I've had them. I've believed I've heard dead people speaking to me. I've seen people that I knew to be dead. And I understand that to be a product of my mind, my grief, my need for them. But when you try to say, I saw a leprechaun on the back porch of the church, if you believe it, you have no one to blame but yourself. There is no evidence for these things. It does not come as a surprise, however, that when the Virgin Mary does put in an appearance somewhere, it's always to some Catholic kids. People who report a vision of Jesus tend to be Protestants. People that report a vision of Buddha tend to be, wait for it, Buddhists. They are not in many cases being dishonest. They've had a profound experience and they report it in the language they know. When the prophet Muhammad had his first vision in the cave in Hira, he thought he had encountered an evil genie. He, in fact, came off the mountain determined to commit suicide because he feared he had become possessed by an evil spirit. But his wife sent him to talk to her cousin, who was a Christian, And she convinced him that it wasn't an evil genie, that it was in fact the angel Gabriel who had visited him, and that he should go back to the cave and wait for the angel Gabriel to come again. Muhammad's wife, Khadijah, and her cousin, Warqa, gave Muhammad the images and the narratives of Jewish and Christian scriptures, and he combined those two with his own Arab history of superstitions and personal experiences, and that is what produced the Quran. He did not actually have a series of conversations with the angel Gabriel. I can say that confidently because the angel Gabriel does not exist. He did, however, have profound mystical experiences that he expressed in the language and images that had been given to him. But faith is not about believing in ghosts. Karen Armstrong talks about this at length, describing the early church's practice of baptism, that when a person was lowered into the water, they came up and shouted the Greek word for faith, pistis, which meant not faith. It meant courage. It meant courage. For them, it was an exclamation that they had chosen to have faith in a way of living and believing that meant they were going to defy the empire, that meant they were going to defy their own family, that meant it was going to defy the existing synagogue or the church of their experience. In those early years, becoming a Christian was an act of defiance against every form of authority in the world, and it required pistis, a kind of faith that was conviction, a decision, a powerful and courageous decision, not a suspension of belief, of reason, but a two-fisted grip on, I'm going to be this kind of person. Martin Luther King has said that faith is taking the first step even when you can't see the whole staircase. That you don't necessarily have all of the information, but you know the direction you're going to go in. That's not a matter of assassinating your brains. It is a matter of having the courage to go into the unknown. It may not immediately feel like it, but it's related, and I need to introduce or reintroduce another theological concept that's important for us to talk about next, and that is personification. As humans evolved consciousness, as we became self-aware, we experienced life through our emotions. We felt about things. And so out of fear, elation, sadness, desire, we tended to interpret the world the same way through those emotions. So a storm, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, the change of the seasons were not matters of meteorology or tectonic movements. They were emotions, that the sky could be angry, the ocean could be angry. They projected personhood. They personified aspects of nature and interpreted events as the emotions of those animated aspects of life. The sun, the wind, thunder, rain, rivers, the ocean, the earth, all became gods and goddesses who, just like we do, fall in love, get jealous, get hungry, get angry, or get sleepy. This instinct is not foreign to us even in the 21st century. The Nature Conservancy has produced an amazing series of short videos in which they recruited actors and actresses with very familiar voices to speak as though they were these aspects of nature. Do yourself a favor, truly. Look these up on YouTube. They're amazing. Julia Roberts gives voice to Mother Earth. Harrison Ford voices the ocean. Penelope Cruz is water. I'll listen to Penelope Cruz if she's just knitting. Robert Redford speaks as the redwood forest. Personifying these aspects of nature makes nature relatable to us because we experience the world as persons. So we relate to nature as a person. It draws us closer and makes it easier for us to be persuaded to care. But Julia Roberts isn't really Mother Nature, is she? And Harrison Ford isn't really Poseidon, the god of the ocean. Of course not. These are just images that we use to talk about important things. The same way Muhammad turned his mystical experience into conversations with Gabriel. And people have, through the years, done the same with Jesus, with Moses, with Mary, with Buddha, with Zeus, with Odin, etc. While personifications may be helpful in telling a story or as a teaching technique, we should not confuse our illustrations with reality. Now, you might reasonably ask me, why does any of this matter? Go ahead, ask. Well, let me tell you. If your cousin goes to a Pentecostal church and thinks that they speak in tongues by channeling the language of angels or of God through their own body, if your Catholic aunt prays the rosary, lights candles at the feet of statues of saints, and wears a scapular under her blouse so that no demons can jump into her soul, or if your Mormon neighbor still wears magic underwear in the belief that it will protect them from car accidents or plane crashes, what's the harm? Why does it matter? Well, maybe I could be more gracious about this, but still, I have this caveat, and I think Voltaire said it best. Those who can make you believe in absurdities can get you to commit atrocities. What goes through the mind of the person who killed all those Muslims in Christchurch in New Zealand in May, and the guy who killed the people in the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, or the guy who murdered all of those people in the Pittsburgh synagogue last October, or the two tragic shootings that we experienced yesterday and last night in Texas and in Ohio? What about when your religious beliefs inspire violence or perpetuate misogyny or homophobia or racism or sexism or nationalism? Can you say it's harmless what people believe if there's a casualty count? If it causes murder and wars, can you honestly say that magical thinking doesn't have a victim? Of course it does. It's 2019. We have to change. One of our native sons of Missouri, H. Richard Niebuhr, says it this way: religion makes good people better, makes bad people worse. A great deal of magical and superstitious aspects of traditional religion is just way too easy to be co-opted by people who use it to oppress women, to discriminate against gay and lesbian and transgender people, and to justify military and terrorist violence between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and sometimes Buddhists. Religion can promote good things or bad things, and we have come to a time when we need to work hard on extinguishing the bad things and accentuating the good things. As Karen Armstrong famously writes in her autobiography, if your understanding of the divine made you kinder, more empathetic, and impelled you to express this sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, that's good theology. If your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, it was bad theology. Compassion was the litmus test for the prophets of Israel, for the rabbis of the Talmud, for Jesus, for Paul, for Muhammad, not to mention Confucius or the Buddha or the sages of the Upanishads. The church has been sold a truckload of snake oil, being told that you have to put your brain on the shelf and believe any number of totally ridiculous things in order to be a good Catholic or a good Baptist or a good Muslim or a good Jew or a good Buddhist. May I remind you that if you take the narrative at face value, what made Moses a famous religious leader was by leading slaves out of bondage. Buddha, tradition has it, was born a prince, but he abandoned wealth and power to live in poverty and taught others to care for the poor. Jesus was a teacher of radical compassion, befriending lepers, tax collectors, prostitutes, and foreigners. And Muhammad, in stark contrast to the caliphs and sheiks who followed him, Muhammad, though having access to great wealth and power, lived in a tiny house and wore ragged clothes in a lifelong identity with the poor. I contend that every major world religion began as a reformation intended to bring social justice to the poor and to the vulnerable. And in each case, after the deaths of the first generation of each of those religions, the religion evolved into creedal faiths manipulated by the powerful in order to use it to control the vulnerable. Moses didn't set out to create a Zionist form of nationalism. He spoke truth to power and told the Pharaoh to let my people go, not go build a wall to capture the vulnerable. Jesus wasn't some lunatic who thought he was God, who was going to die for the sins of the world. He was a teacher who taught people to love their enemies and to forgive their brothers and sisters. Our religious narratives should not be encased in stained glass windows, repeated in creeds, and diving into wishful thinking for an afterlife. Our faith should be a matter of good deeds, of kindness, of mercy shown to the undeserving, and compassion shown to the sick, the poor, the immigrant, the imprisoned, the grieving, and the lonely. Now, there are those who will insist upon reiterating a literal belief on Easter Sunday that Jesus physically came out of the tomb. There are those who, without any evidence, will insist that heaven and hell are real, that they have an eternal soul that is denied to the chickens, pigs, and fish that we eat, or at least we hope they don't have a soul. We don't want to encounter them in the afterlife and have to explain how tasty they are. They may continue to believe in a supernatural theistic friend who lives in the clouds and grants wishes. But let me tell you, I don't know anything about those things. If any of those things are true, I don't know anything about them. You don't know anything about them. No religion anywhere of any sort knows anything about them. What I do know for a fact is that more than half of the children in our school system are growing up in poverty. What I do know for a fact is that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 4 boys will be sexually molested before they turn 18. I know that millions of people are being refused health care. Millions of others are being refused housing and access to education in the richest country in the world. I know that more than 30,000 people in my country are going to die from gunshot wounds this year. I know that 60,000 are going to die from drug addiction. I know that our border security is currently holding 15,000 children in tiny, nasty cages separated from their parents, where they are cold and hungry and sick. I know that in 2019, women still earn significantly less than men on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, no woman has ever been elected head of state. And that most churches still think you have to have boy parts in your underwear in order to preach or to administer sacraments. I will tell you that I have had boy parts in my underwear for the entire 40 years that I have been a parish pastor, and I have never used them in writing or delivering a sermon. And I have a very strong sense that that policy is not going to change. It is time for the church to begin to deal with what is real rather than what they wish was real or they imagine was real. In closing, let me quote Virgil, who wrote in the Aeneid, Haud Ignota Loquor, speak not of what is not known. We must get our heads out of the sand and be more concerned with how we live our faith and less concerned about the magical beliefs of our ancestors.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.